If you're looking for information on the Murder at Castle Nathria meta, you're in the right place. I'm Uncorrupt, and I'm going to be going over the Vicious Syndicate number 238 report, sprinkled along with my own seasoning of, my own wisdom that I've gleaned from playing the game myself. Just real quick before we get started, I always like to say this at the beginning of these meta reviews. I'm not affiliated with Vicious Syndicate in any way. You can see these fine people right down here at the bottom of the report put this together. They do a lot of hard work. Definitely get out and support them in all the different social media locations that you might be able to find them. A lot of work goes into this, and hats off to them. I'm just a fan of what they do, and I think we can definitely gain some insights from the work that they put in. So, coming down to take a look, overall number of games. This number is always pretty interesting because it just speaks to the volume of games that are being played, how popular the game is, and then of course, if the sample size is too small, the data doesn't mean anything. Over 1 million. People are really playing a lot of Murder at Castle Nathria, as you would expect with a brand new expansion. Coming down to take a look at just the most popular decks here, we see Imp Warlock is actually number 1, Spooky Mage, Ramp Druid, Face Hunter, Control Shaman, and then it kind of falls off from there. So a bit surprising for me to see Imp Warlock number 1. I don't see a whole lot of Imp Warlock just where I'm at on the ladder. I feel like the thing that I see the most of is actually probably just Mage and Druid. So I guess just the pocket that I'm in, not as many Imp Warlocks. So, and I don't really have a problem with Imp Warlock. Seems to be significantly more played in the Diamond 1 to Diamond 4 range. So if you're trying to hit Legend, you're probably going to be running into a lot of Imp Warlocks. And then, yeah, you can see, so at Legend, it starts to fall off, and pretty much the same played rate at top 1K Legend. But interestingly enough, in the top 1K, Warlock is the most popular class, but there's some more experimentation. ViciousSyndicate.com, by the way, if you want to check out the report for yourself, focus more on the ranks that you're interested in and where you're playing. Class frequency discussion. Warlock has been one of the most impactful classes at the launch of Castle Nathria. Imp Warlock instantly become one of the most popular decks in the format starting on day 1. I was one of the day 1 Imp Warlock players. I had a lot of early success with it, but to me it felt like the meta kind of caught up to it, and it was not as successful in the following days. Upper Diamond ranks, play rate exceeds 20%. It is largely perceived to be the strongest choice on the climb to Legend. So one of the things that I've always been an advocate of, if you're climbing to Legend, is play an aggro deck. The quick games are just a big help if you're trying to hit Legend. It doesn't matter if it's the first time or not. You just want to get through those games as quickly as possible. Play as much as you can, because getting to Legend is just a numbers game. If you're in that Diamond 1 to Diamond 5 range, you're already good enough to hit Legend. It's just a matter of playing enough games at the win rate that you're currently at to actually be able to seal the deal. Most of the archetype consists of a standard aggressive build. I think that's what I've been seeing. But it looks like people are experimenting with Abyssal Curse, and Phylactery Warlock would probably be like Naval Mines. Might see some of that. Enthusiasm for Mage is similarly high. Wildfire Mage has incorporated the skeleton package to become Spooky Mage. I guess we're going to be calling it Spooky Mage. This archetype exhibits a stable play rate around 15%. Split between normal size and the extra large Renathal lists. I think I prefer the 30 card list. Ladder intended to combat Hunter and Warlock aggression. Big Spell Mage sees very little play in comparison. Secret Mage just never took off. I don't think there's a whole lot of interest in secrets in general, and I feel like if you're the Blizzard development team, you kind of have to think to yourself, should we ever print another secret ever again? Because secrets are typically boring. The only time I'm personally playing secrets is in Quest Hunter, specifically because Dunbaldar Bunker is just good draw combined with the secrets, and getting 1 mana secrets is good for refreshing your hero power after the quest is played, and then also just a fuel multicaster. It's not because the secrets are good, it's not because I want to play secrets or that I find them interesting, it just kind of works in the deck with the card draw that's available. Shaman is exhibiting a steady and consistent rise in play throughout the ladder since launch day, and its popularity peaks at Legend, where it's a top 3 class. No surprise there. Players at low ranks didn't get the memo, so, a little bit farther down the ladder, maybe you're not running into Shaman as much, but as you climb, you're going to see Shaman more and more. I feel like Shaman is probably one of the strongest decks, just because of the tools that it has access to, and the matchups that you're going to be facing. So, it feels like Shaman a lot of times is a really strong deck that just doesn't gain traction. The player base seems like they don't want to play Shaman even when it's a good deck, which I find to be a little bit strange, but Shaman has felt underplayed to me for quite a while, the last several months. Control Shaman looking like a pillar of the format. While it's currently experimenting with many builds, a specific Renathal variant popularized by Habu Gabu has taken off, leaving all other builds behind. That's an evolved Shaman. I've seen it on the ladder. Habu definitely popularized this thing because it was the only shaman list people were playing probably for a solid day or two, which when you think that the expansion's only been out a little over a week, that's a significant amount of time. Ramp Druid highly visible since launch. Denathrius Topior Mine variants were taking off early with the goal of drawing Denathrius as soon as possible, winning through a Brand Kael'thas combo. Some builds have begun to abandon that plan and look for Naga Giants. I've seen that, and Herald of Nature to have a more versatile set of possible win conditions. Celestial Druid hanging out with a lower pay rate, mostly sticking with Kazakhstan, but a minority is flirting with Brand Denathrius. I think I've only seen like one Celestial Alignment Druid, and I was actually mad. I was mad that somebody was still playing that deck, and I really felt like, in my mind, it made me feel better to think it's because they're too poor to afford the new cards. So they're having to play an old deck. I really don't like Celestial Alignment. Hopefully that card gets the nerf to the point that it's unplayable sometime soon. Hunter gaining more traction every day with 3 visible archetypes, all incorporated Wild Seeds into their build. I feel like Wild Seeds are actually good. Certainly Wild Spirits, I think, probably the strongest card that Hunter received in this expansion. Face Hunter is the most popular deck, mostly running collateral damage at the top end. I'm not a fan of collateral damage at all. If you follow me on Twitter, you've probably seen me tweet about it. I played something like 50 games of a Face Hunter with collateral damage, and I was never actually able to play it because the game was over by the time I got to turn 8. Either I won or I had lost by that turn, or the card just gets drawn and sticks in my hand. I'd rather it be any other card in my deck. I've actually never been able to play collateral damage in that many games. To me, it's a cut. It doesn't matter how good it is. If the game isn't going long enough to be able to play it, it's worthless. Beast Hunter has kept the Big Beast package and paired it with Wild Seeds. Quest Hunter is experimenting with Wild Seeds. One of my more recent videos was Quest Hunter with a couple of Wild Seeds cards. Stag Charge, it's just a direct damage spell that you can utilize in Quest Hunter, and then Wild Spirits is just good enough probably to see play in every Hunter deck. It's just a really, really good card. Rogue has been trying many different approaches. None of its decks seem to have found a footing just yet. Thief Rogue is figuring out whether it wants to run a secret package and whether it wants to run Renathal. Miracle Rogue is mostly played at Legend with players at higher levels trying to figure out if it's new APM bait or the new Garrote Rogue. Death Rattle Rogue is converging back to Naval Mines after some teasing with Stoneborn General and Masked Reveler. Almost no one is playing Quest Rogue. Rogue, I feel like, hasn't been experimented with enough. Most of the experimentation has come in the form of the Miracle deck, where you're playing like Loan Sharks, lots of coins, huge weapon off of Draka, and then a big minion off of the Sinstone Graveyard. I feel like there's going to be some version of Boat Rogue that should be pretty good. May not be any higher than Tier 2, but that's still, a serviceable deck and a playable deck in the meta. Secret Rogue, I'm not sure. People just don't have an appetite for secrets. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. People aren't interested in playing secrets, so, do you really want to print more secret cards if you're Blizzard? It feels like classes that get secrets, it's almost like wasted card slots. That's how the community sees it. So then it feels like instead of getting an entire expansion, if this is your favorite class, your main class, maybe you only got like half an expansion. And that definitely feels bad when you're receiving cards that you're not going to play and that just don't appeal really to anybody. If Secret Rogue is a strong deck, I think more people are going to play it. It's just not going to be super interesting and fun gameplay. Also, the drawback to secrets is, your opponent kind of decides when your secret is going to see its payoff. And, that's also bad. You can play around the secrets and then they just end up being worthless, at least for a certain number of turns. Priest seeing modest play. Quest Priest is the most common opponent at lower ranks, while Naga Priest shows up a bit more at Legend, but is as unpopular as ever. Other decks are not very visible. Even Boar Priest barely sees any play at top Legend. Boar Priest is probably still a really good deck. I think as the meta tends to settle more, we're going to see the top players, the good Boar Priest players, are going to go back to that because it's still going to be successful. Naga Priest is actually a good deck, but it's a deck, again, that the community has just never really had an appetite for. It may actually be stronger now than it was previously, and it was a good deck previously. I got blown out of one game, a very memorable game for me. It was a turn 3 Pelagos, so they played a turn 2 Murkwater Scribe, which gives them a free Serpent Wig. Then on turn 3, Pelagos Wig. It was an 8-8 Pelagos, and I think I conceded on the spot, likely while muttering, maybe some bad words or something. Paladin, Demon Hunter, and Warrior are non-existent at top Legend, which is bad news for the rest of the ladder. Players at high levels are uninterested in experimenting. It means no new builds can trickle down from content creators and influencers, and the class presence will only dwindle further. Pure Paladin, Death Rattle DH, and Enraged Warrior are the most notable archetypes at lower ranks because they got some day one exposure, but it's been very quiet since. I specifically dedicated like an entire day to experimenting with Enraged Warrior, and it's just not good enough. I lost a lot. I lost a lot of ranks as well, but it's just not good enough for me. Warrior, there's just not enough early game. If your plan is to damage your own minions and be able to increase their attack, then you need minions with higher health. But what we find is, things like Armor Vendor, the 2-mana 1/4, 4 health just isn't enough. It doesn't stick on the board for multiple turns. The infused weapon just isn't good. Warrior's new infused weapon. Even if you're able to infuse it, which kind of seems unlikely to be quite honest, adding 2/2 to, 1 minion that you can get to stick on the board just isn't going to be good enough. So it feels like Warrior has the win conditions with things like Grom and possibly Decimator Olgra, but you just have a hard time getting to that point in the game. Typically, Warrior's just getting run over, and it should be a tempo deck, and the tools just aren't there. Demon Hunter, I've said all along, the Relic package is slow, but it's going to snowball pretty hard. I still think that's the case, but Demon Hunter has kind of been shoehorned into the only win condition that it really has access to is Fell Spells and Jace. And so if you're playing these slow Relic cards that go along with that, it just has anti-synergy with your deck, and it's like you're working against your own game plan. So Demon Hunter, again, just not in a good spot. The Relic package, it should be good. It should be reasonably fun, I think, if you can get it to work. The problem is you just can't get it to work. The support's not there. Pure Paladin, Paladin is Paladin. It's always boring. For the last many expansions, if Paladin has any kind of a good deck, it's a very boring control deck, like Holy Paladin from the previous expansion. People aren't going to really see it. There's no true win condition for the class. It's pretty much just Cariel so you can't die, and then heal back up so you can't die, and then buff minions with Cariel hero power. So just not very fun, not very interesting, I think, for a lot of people, and also just not very powerful with the other decks that we have here. I'll let you check this out on your own. You can see the heat map for the different ranks here, but it just has a little bit more data about the matchups. Of course, the darker red, the worse the matchup is. The brighter green, the better it is. And taking a look, top 1K Legend, there's a lot of tier 1 decks right now. This isn't going to last. The meta is still shifting a lot. People are still experimenting, and these decks that are in the tier 1 bracket are really just beating very, very weak decks. The entire first week of a new expansion is people playing bad decks poorly. Decks are being refined over time. People are learning the play patterns over time. The decks get better, the people get better. But now what we're seeing is these decks are pretty good, and they're just victimizing people that are out here playing Holy Paladin, Totem Shaman, Mech Mage. I can't even believe people are still playing Mech Mage. Prester Druid. So these decks are just beating really the garbage decks that people are playing. The meme deck players, the off-meta enjoyers, if you will. So there's really not going to be this many tier 1 decks. That's just the way it looks right now. And again, I always like to throw out a crafting warning. Be careful what you're crafting right now. It is a little over a week into the expansion, but things are still changing. And I think there's going to be some new decks that come to light. I think Rogue is going to have a good deck at some point that's not, miracle-based and coin-based. Getting into the power ranking discussion, most glaring characteristic of the first week is that good classes are good and bad classes are very, very bad. Strongest decks in the format will always have inflated win rates in the new meta since they're facing many bad decks. That's exactly what I was just saying. Bad decks will eventually disappear, leading to a more competitive field in which top meta decks will have their win rates decline, as expected. We'll discuss some potential power outliers at the top end, but we can't say this is where things are most egregious when we look at next week's potential patch. So Blizzard has kind of teased 2 weeks into the expansion they would do a balance patch. It's probably actually too early. I don't think they have enough data, and there hasn't been enough experimentation, but there could be some changes coming relatively quickly here. Biggest power outliers are at the bottom. We can't remember when so many classes were this bad, void of any competitive aspiration. So I think one of the ideas that's been floated by the community is we don't really need nerfs. There's nothing strong enough to deserve a nerf, and that's arguable. People have their opinions on that. But really just these bottom classes need buffs. Talking about Warrior and Demon Hunter specifically, Priest could maybe use a little bit of love. Rogue could maybe use a little bit of love. But just some classes that seem to be suffering with no real options. And that's especially bad, when you have class specialists or if you have people with a limited dust collection. Maybe you have players who spend all of their dust just getting all of the class cards for 1 or 2 specific classes. And if you're unlucky enough to be like Demon Hunter and Warrior right now, then and you're really just not enjoying the game, and the game is basically unplayable. If you can't win any more than 38-40% of your games, you're probably not going to be playing Hearthstone for very long. So hopefully those classes are going to get some help in very short order, but hopefully we're not going to nerf things too early and remove, fun decks that have a reasonable amount of power that people just don't like for whatever reason. Imp Warlock is obviously very strong. It was a clear front-runner deck on the first day of the expansion, but other decks have caught up and are challenging its top spot. It gets reliably countered by Control Shaman, so if you're in that Diamond 1 to Diamond 4 range and you're seeing a lot of Imp Warlock, Control Shaman, you're really just looking for the board freezes, Snowfall Guardian, and the Brilliant Macaws to be able to repeat those freezes. If the Shaman can't attack with the minions, it can't kill you, and you're going to end up with some really, really big Snowfall Guardians that can go face and win the game. And Spooky Mage, again, that just comes down to the freezes, things like Fury, Varden, and the location. You're able to freeze those big imps on the board, buy yourself some time to be able to kill your opponent. Since they have good board stalling tools, I'm actually getting a little bit ahead of my report here. Warlock is completely reliant on board development. There's no from-hand damage other than buffing minions that are already on the board. Warlock shines in the Druid matchup. That's because it's going to run over Druids that are just doing nothing or, at best, ramping, trying to get to some of the things that they're going to be doing. Imp Warlock obliterates any sort of ramp Druid deck, as well as rogues lacking the ability to respond to their stat vomit. So if you're coming up against Warlock, Imp Warlock specifically, you're going to have to be able to challenge the board. You're going to have to be able to remove their minions. Otherwise, they snowball, the game gets out of control, and you maybe lose on turn 5 to Shady Bartender or turn 6, potentially with a Reform play. I think it's likely to receive some sort of tuning next week. We would caution from making heavy-handed nerfs. I guess a specific note to the developers here. Very light touch might be more appropriate. At a reasonably strong power level, Imp Warlock is a healthy deck for the format. I agree. You always need aggro. Nerf it too hard and you will create a new problem. It is largely responsible for keeping Druid in check, and Ramp Druid looks extremely powerful in the absence of Imps. So again, if Imp Warlock gets nerfed, Druid just runs out of control, and then we're back to Druid Stone. I don't think anybody's really looking forward to that. Not much else can be found in the class. Curse is weak. Phylactery Warlock is serviceable at higher levels, only as a Shaman counter, it looks like. Spooky Mage gets a lot of hype, but we can't see an overly powerful deck here. The archetype hovers around an average win rate, even sinking below average as we get to the higher ranks. It's effective against Imp Warlock while breaking even with Shaman, but has a problem dealing with Druid and Hunter. So I can specifically speak to the Druid matchup. You have to run Theatar, and pretty much you have to Theatar their Denathrius, otherwise it's a guaranteed loss. Even if you can get the Denathrius, it's still possible to lose because of the amount of pressure that the Druid decks can put out with Shrubagaze or Topior. They can flood their deck with 3/3s easily and multiple times. And then also you're seeing variants that are running like Naga Sea Giants and things like that. So it's definitely a very, very hard matchup for the Mage. And also Hunter, Quest Hunter specifically feels like it has a good matchup into Skeleton Mage. Skeleton Mage just kind of struggles because the Face Hunter is just dealing so much damage from off the board. So Spooky Mage is going to be good against decks that try to develop a board presence because it can freeze those minions and just continue to punch face. Not necessarily an aggro deck, but Mage, you're probably going to be wanting to play it like a tempo deck. And you can just prevent your opponent from removing your minions, go face, do a lot of damage, and then you potentially, remove more your minions and theirs with something like a Deathborn, which spews more damage off of your side of the board into your opponent, but then also it's going to give you a board back with the 2/2s that it creates. So definitely a couple of matchups that are going to be tough for Mage just because the way the matchup tends to go. It can do better against Face Hunter by running Renathal, but makes it bad against Ramp Druid. Without the extra life cushion, it gets destroyed by the relentless damage that Hunter can dish out. It's a deck that players seem to have a lot of fun with, which leads to a high play rate, but not something we should be concerned with whatsoever. I think people are probably playing the deck wrong. Spooky Mage is a little bit better than what's being indicated. This report, again, is based entirely on the data that Vicious Syndicate is able to collect. I don't think they put in a whole lot of personal opinion. My personal opinion is there's a lot of people that are playing Spooky Mage incorrectly, and it's a little bit better, but I don't think it's an overpowered deck. I think the win rate should certainly be a little bit higher than what it is, though. We'll see as time will tell. I'm going to work on a Spooky Mage video, see if we can help some people out with those. Best Mage deck is the one that doesn't see much play. Big Spell Mage is producing a Tier 1 performance. I don't know who's playing Big Spell Mage. I haven't seen it. Apparently somebody is, and they're winning a lot of games. Barely adding new cards from the Nathria set. One of the most reliable answers to Control Shaman, a deck that's difficult to counter and should heavily influence the format going forward. We're not sure Big Spell Mage would be this good if it were popular, but it's certainly the biggest sleeper of the week, so they're already kind of calling out like the meta breaker or the sleeper of the week is actually Big Spell Mage. It's a deck that can be targeted, but because it's not being targeted, it does really well against the existing format. So something to keep in mind there, Big Spell Mage. I'm not really a believer, but that's what they're saying at least. Control Shaman looks fantastic, strong win rate, and a very good matchup spread. This deck seems to be the most difficult to counter, making it arguably the best and most reliable deck in the format. Just a couple options available that are clearly favored against Control Shaman. That's Big Spell Mage and Phylactery Warlock. And Shaman, I think, has room to get a little bit better because for some reason it appears that so many people have cut Wild Paw Caverns it's just an incredible tempo tool for the class. They call it a Control Shaman deck, but sometimes you can actually just win on tempo because you're flooding the board with Murlocs or you're flooding the board with the 3/4 stags off of the Wild Paw Cavern. So I think this deck can actually get a little bit better as well, likely from card inclusions, in addition to, people can always play better. Is Control Shaman gearing up to become the new meta tyrant that must be stopped? We're not sure this would be an apt description. Shaman may be hard to counter, but it's not favored into many decks either. It beats bad decks, looks favored into board-centric decks, again Snowfall Guardians, Brilliant Macaws, and goes 50-50 with many of the other good decks in the format. It doesn't seem to dominate the emerging field, and we will explain a little bit later on what kind of impact heavy-handed Shaman nerfs would have on the format. Ramp Druid is a powerful deck that's kept in check by an oppressive matchup against Imp Warlock. The high presence of Imps is relegating the archetype to an average win rate, rather than one that would have clearly placed it at the top tier. This deck is also further developing, with refinement lagging behind other popular classes that have figured out something close to the optimal build. Druid is still fixated on its early expansion iterations. We can identify ways to make the deck stronger. We likely have not seen the deck's final form in this week's database. So they're saying Ramp Druid's actually going to get better, which is a little bit scary when you think about it, because Ramp Druid, if you do nothing against that deck in the early turns, you just lose. And sometimes they can draw well enough that you can actually make proactive, strong plays in the early game, and they're able to either shut those down or survive long enough to be able to get to some type of a board clear in the form of Scale of Onyxia. Sometimes Flipper Friends is enough. Celestial Druid is struggling. I'm not going to read any more than that because I'm so happy to hear that. Celestial Alignment. Please stop playing it. Please stop playing it. I'm tired of seeing that deck. Hunter is a top 3 class in the format, considering it currently has 3 top-tier archetypes. Seems to be highly influential on how the good classes are built, as its popularity is partly responsible for the surge of Renathal decks. People are trying to get extra health by including Renathal in their deck just because of Face Hunter specifically, I would assume. We do know that Hunter tends to be a strong front-runner, and all of its decks excel at punishing the kind of inefficient garbage you see at the beginning of expansion. That might be what's happening here. So Hunter typically stronger early on and then falls off late because Hunter is almost always an aggro deck based on the hero power, based on the cards that it has access to. So Face Hunter could see a decline. That's typically what happens as expansions tend to move on and gain some age. Face Hunter is the most popular and most successful Hunter deck in the moment. Its success seems to be highly driven by countering some of the lesser decks in the format rather than great matchups into the best decks. It's strong against Spooky Mage and has been encouraging that archetype to run Renathal. It punishes weak and underwhelming rogue class, but doesn't actually do much else. It doesn't beat Ramp Druid or Control Shaman. It loses to other Hunter decks. It loses to Imp Warlock and Naga Priest. When you take a deeper look at its performance, you realize Face Hunter is unlikely to remain top tier in a refined and settled meta. So pretty much it's just victimizing bad decks at the moment. I touched on that a little bit earlier. Face Hunter is not going to be it as we move forward. Quest Hunter is a harder counter to Mage, beats Spooky Mage even when it runs Renathal. It beats Face Hunter in the direct matchup, but pays for it with a worse Druid matchup. Quest Hunter gets obliterated by any form of ramping Druid deck, so if it ever gets popular, there's a clear-cut answer available. We think it's going to be stronger than Face Hunter, but it's unlikely to become much better than it is right now. So Quest Hunter, again, it's good, it's not great, and it's probably going to tail off and maybe get a little bit worse. It's really going to depend also on what happens with the nerfs that are being floated for this kind of 1 week in the future timeline. We'll have to see what happens. Beast Hunter may have the worst matchup spread of the three, since it's more board-centric and doesn't have as much burst from hand. It's worse against Mage and Shaman. It doesn't handle Ramp Druid well. You'd think this deck doesn't have an actual future based on these statements, but Beast Hunter has more room for improvement, as well as a way to solve some of its issues in common late-game matchups. We don't think it'll be a top-tier deck, but it should be alright. I would say okay. It'll be okay. Rogue is standing on shaky ground. Its archetypes all have question marks surrounding them, and the lack of novelty is concerning. Miracle Rogue's current performance is horrendous, including at top legend where it's most prevalent. It's interesting to note that it is currently the deck with the highest skill ceiling in the format. It improves a lot at higher levels of play. In fact, its average matchup improves nearly 10% from Platinum to Legend. These are Garrote-esque numbers, considering that the deck is very unrefined and new to players who are just learning how to pilot it. It's reasonable to assume that it can get better. Question is how much better? Its current win rate at top legend is 44%. So listen, don't let these guys fool you. These influencers that are tweeting and creating content. I broke the meta breaker deck. You see anybody talking about specifically Miracle Rogue? And if they didn't break the meta, they're winning 44% just like everybody else is. They probably just high rolled for a very small amount of time and then tried to use that to bait and or gain influence within the community. It would have to make a very dramatic climb in its performance in order to become competitive. Otherwise, it will be a terrible deck at lower ranks and a bad deck at high levels. We'll have to wait and see. Secret package is terrible, so terrible that any experimentation in Thief Rogue that incorporates this package looks like a crime against Hearthstone. That's tough. Renathal doesn't work in Rogue either. Thief Rogue currently performs at its best when it runs no new cards, and even this best is not much better than Tier 4, so Rogue kind of struggling here. Thief Rogue specifically. This leaves us with Bomb Rogue currently taking over the Death Rattle Rogue cluster. This looks like the most competitive Rogue deck, and it still is stellar. We wouldn't expect it to gain much traction as it runs no new cards and doesn't counter a deck we're desperate to counter. It also suffers from the popularity of Renathal, so Rogue just kind of struggling. Naga Priest looks good. Control Shaman matchup is difficult, but it handles the rest of the field well. It contests early board control against Face Hunter and Imp Warlock. It wrecks Druid. It even does well against Mage, despite the number of freeze effects they possess. Unlike Shaman, it's hard for Mage to get rid of buffed minions. It doesn't have Primordial Wave. It can stall for a long time, but it's hard to do that while mounting an effective counterattack against the Priest. Cathedral of Atonement is amazing in the deck, and has been a big consistency boost. The only problem with Naga Priest is, once again, almost no one cares to play it. Apparently it's just not very fun or interesting. There's something about it that must be incredibly off-putting. So on that we certainly agree. I don't know, I've tried playing Naga Priest. I just wasn't really having a good time. And if it's very strong, it could be good in the tournament scene, a good competitive deck. But when you're sitting down to just grind on ladder, you want to play something that's fun. Otherwise you're not going to be grinding, you're going to be quitting very, very quickly. So unfortunately, Naga Priest just not very fun to play. And I kind of see why. I mean, how fun is it to just buff your minions? Yeah, it's powerful. Oh, I got a huge minion. Oh, I'm punching face for, 15 attack. But it doesn't really feel all that challenging. It's kind of draw-based. You have to have wigs. You have to have Nagas to be able to refresh the wig and get it back in your hand. So just not super, super fun. And to be honest, I mean, I like Quest Hunter, but Quest Hunter is the same for me. I can't just crush out a lot of games back-to-back of Quest Hunter. It is fun, but it wears thin pretty quickly. Other Priest decks, not so good. Quest Priest looks pretty bad. Spooky Mage matchup is brutal, while Ramp Druid isn't much better. Purified Shard is getting outclassed in the late-game meta that's developing, and things are unlikely to get better. Shadow Priest doesn't work, while Boar Priest might be Tier 3 at top legend. I feel like Boar Priest is probably going to be a little bit better than Tier 3 at top legend. If you can get the weapon online early enough, you just shut down so many different things. But we'll see. A Paladin, Demon Hunter, and Warrior, you know it's bad when they're all grouped together. Pretty clear-cut, classes are unplayable. Unless there's an incredible discovery, it's unlikely you'll see much of them in this format. So listen, if you're a content creator and you're trying to strike gold and get popular really fast, you just need to find a good Paladin, Demon Hunter, or Warrior deck that's fun and that destroys a lot of other decks, climb a lot of ranks with it, and you'll probably be popular before you ever know it. If such a thing even exists. But we'll see. Pure and Holy Paladin are Tier 4 at best. Wouldn't be surprised to see them get worse as they exhibit no scope for improvement. Demon Hunter and Warrior are in a different universe. Their decks exhibit win rates in the 30s, which is pretty much unheard of. They're just incredibly weak. They're far away from being remotely playable. They might be the two worst classes we've ever seen at the launch of an expansion. That's really saying a lot when you think about it. Reminds us of Paladin and Hunter during Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. That was a long time ago. For them to see play next week, they need to be buffed. And then we got a nice little section on balance changes here. So let's see what they think about possible balance changes. This is something where I would say that I personally just don't have an opinion on. I would like to see things buffed, but I have no idea what it would be. I don't have access to data. And I feel like the average person, probably the nerfs and or buffs that they would offer up are probably either too heavy-handed one way or the other. It's likely we'll have a balance patch next week based on our analysis. It's going to be challenging to hand out big nerfs to some decks without making the meta worse rather than better. And we've seen that before. Sometimes things get nerfed and the meta actually gets worse. There were a lot of people that felt like all of the Warrior nerfs last expansion were too heavy-handed and actually gave us a worse meta, especially with Drekthar still being left alone at that time. Yeah, it was just tough. Demon Hunter mirrors. We don't want to go back to like Druid Stone or Demon Hunter Stone, where you just play too many mirrors. Let's see. Here are the key points on why this could be a big headache for Team 5. Team 5, of course, the team that works on Hearthstone, they call them Team 5. Let's say we decide Control Shaman is a developing meta tyrant and comply with demands for nerf to Snowfall Guardian, which would be a very significant change. This forces us to nerf Imp Warlock harder, as without a powerful Shaman deck keeping it in check, it could spin out of control. So if they touch Shaman, Imp Warlock gets too good. If we're then preemptively nerfing Druid to solve the potential problem, Druid would be much, much stronger if Imp Warlock was nerfed. Hunter is the next in line to become a massive problem, as we've just nerfed Warlock and Druid, its two most prominent counters. Now we need to nerf Hunter, but if we're nerfing both Hunter and Druid on top of Shaman and Warlock, we're now risking Spooky Mage becoming a lot stronger. The deck is already popular at a modest and healthy power level. What would it look like with Spooky Mage actually being good? Like, the play rate would be insane. 50% of the ladder would be mages. When you look at the whole picture, the current meta is pretty balanced at the top. 5 classes seeing similar levels of play. Most strategies have an answer that keeps them in check. Control Shaman is the most difficult to counter, but it's a deck that exhibits a lot of 50-50 matchups. That means there's going to be a lot more skill-based decisions, I would think, if it's 50-50, and that's what I'm interested in. Let me be able to outplay my opponent. I don't want to just lose because their deck has a significantly favored matchup against me. It's not destroying everything in its path. There is fair concern it could find a way to get even better and start destroying, but it's possible that other decks will target it harder. It's hard to say what's more likely to occur. Most pressing question is whether widespread nerfs would make the game better. I'm of the opinion that they probably wouldn't. Would it give us more decks to play with? Are some touches to the top class is going to make anyone play Demon Hunter and Warrior? That's going to be a no. Those decks are way too weak. Would it help Rogue and Paladin from dwindling further into irrelevance? Or is it just going to make everyone feel worse because they're playing worse decks? And I think that's going to be the danger. If you're nerfing the good decks, then all of a sudden people are going to be playing bad decks because that's going to be the best deck that's left. I would hate to think that we're going to be playing the best deck left after a series of nerfs. So that's why I'm hoping for buffs. Those classes that are underperforming, give them some help. Try to get them up there. And, you know, don't touch the stuff at the top because there's nothing really running away with the format at this time. The reason the bad classes are bad is because they're bad. It took an entire meta report to figure that out. We need to make them less bad and more good. If they can compete and stand with the rest, this would be a very successful meta. It'll be interesting to see what Team 5 decides to do, as buffs rarely happen on the first patch of an expansion, but they seem necessary if we want to have more than 6 to 7 classes in the game for the next month or two. I'm actually going to round that out. That is going to be the meta review for the first week of Castle Nathria. There is going to be more information down specifically to the classes if you're interested in that. Again, that's vicioussyndicate.com. I'm Uncorrupt. Thank you for watching.